Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we turn our attention to a whisper that came across the vastness of the universe, a sound that seemed too deliberate, too precise, to be anything ordinary. For a brief 72 seconds in 1977, humanity stood on the edge of wonder, as though the cosmos itself leaned close and spoke. We call it the wow signal. Before we begin, let me thank you for being here. Whether you are tucked beneath blankets, headphones soft in your ears, or lying awake under a window where the stars themselves flicker faintly, your presence matters. These stories take life because you choose to listen. If you find calm in these journeys, a gentle gesture, a like, a subscribe, a quiet share, is the strongest encouragement. It fuels the nights to come, letting me keep guiding you through mysteries both ancient and cosmic. But a warning should be given. Some stories do not soothe. They unsettle. They linger when the lights are off. They may even keep you awake with questions. Tonight's story, about a signal from beyond the stars, may be one of those. If sleep overtakes you, let it come softly. But if you stay awake, let the wonder keep you company. Now close your eyes and travel back to August 15th, 1977. The summer air in Ohio is thick with cicadas, the night sky clear enough that the Milky Way paints itself across the heavens. In a quiet field near Delaware, Ohio, an enormous structure squats in silence. It is not beautiful in the way of cathedrals or palaces. It is utilitarian, built for one purpose: listening. It was called the Big Ear Radio Telescope, a machine designed to hear what human ears never could. Inside the control room, the machines whir softly. Computers the size of desks hum with the effort of processing constant streams of data. A printer rattles, spitting out long rolls of paper covered in numbers and letters, codes that look meaningless to anyone not trained in the language of radio astronomy. For weeks, for months, the telescope has been sweeping the sky, gathering the endless static of the universe. Most nights, it is nothing but background noise. But on this particular evening, as the Big Ear drifted across a faint constellation called Sagittarius, something unexpected arrived. The signal came like a clear tone out of the chaos. Narrow, precise, sharp against the ocean of random static. For 72 seconds it held, unwavering, as if someone, somewhere, far beyond Earth, pressed a finger to a key and let the sound flow. And then it was gone, never to return. Days later, astronomer Jerry Ehman sat at his desk, reading the reams of paper from the Big Ear. His eyes skimmed over the usual noise, random letters and digits, and then he stopped. His breath caught. The sequence 6EQUJ5 stood out like a bright flame among ashes. It was not just unusual, it was extraordinary. He circled it quickly with his red pen, and in the margin, almost involuntarily, he wrote the word that would become legend. Wow, imagine that moment. A man, alone at his desk, staring at a scrap of paper that might be the first tangible whisper from another intelligence. His pen scratches a single word, but behind that word is a flood of thought. If the signal came from another civilization, then at that very moment humanity was not alone. Since that night, the wow signal has haunted astronomy. Attempts were made to find it again, to point telescopes to the same patch of sky, to wait for the same narrow voice to emerge. But nothing ever came. No repetition, no echo, only silence. Some have tried to explain it. Perhaps it was a natural phenomenon, a comet passing near Earth, emitting radiation in just the right frequency. Perhaps it was a stray military satellite, or even a transmission from Earth itself that bounced strangely. None of these explanations fit perfectly. None could explain why the signal was so strong, so precise, so perfectly placed in the very frequencies scientists had long considered the most logical for interstellar communication. Others chose to dream. They imagined a far-off world, perhaps orbiting a star we cannot see with the naked eye, where a civilization older and wiser than ours chose to send a greeting. Perhaps they broadcast across the sky, not expecting an answer, only hoping someone, somewhere, would one day hear. If so, for 72 seconds, in 1977, we did. What makes the wow? Signal so powerful is its singularity. We humans crave patterns, repetitions, proof. But the universe gave us one note, one whisper, and then retreated into silence. That silence is almost more profound than the signal itself. If they wanted to speak, why did they not speak again? If it was only an accident, why was it so perfectly tuned? As you lie here tonight, think of that. The earth spinning quietly beneath your bed, the stars above fixed in their courses, and somewhere out there, a memory of a signal that came and vanished. Was it a mistake? Was it a message? Or was it simply the universe reminding us that we are still, after all this time, waiting? And perhaps the deeper question is this: what if the silence since is not an absence, but an answer? The night after Jerry Ehman circled that single line of code, the control room of the Big Ear carried a tension that was almost visible. The telescope had swept its path across the stars as usual, its metallic frame creaking softly in the Ohio summer air. But now, instead of the ordinary static of the cosmos, there was the memory of a voice that no one could forget. Scientists at the Ohio State Radio Observatory were not dreamers by profession. They were technicians, engineers, careful astronomers who lived by numbers, charts, and discipline. And yet, that night, as they loaded new rolls of paper into the printers and reset the monitors, an unspoken question lingered in the air. What if the universe had spoken, and what if it might speak again? The Big Ear was designed to listen passively, sweeping the sky as the Earth rotated, recording the natural chorus of radio noise from space. Every star, every galaxy, every faint quasar added its note to the endless static. For years, the telescope had done little more than confirm what astronomers already knew. Space was noisy, but in a chaotic way. Random bursts, crackles, pulses, nothing narrow, nothing disciplined, nothing like the 72-second signal that had stunned Jerry Ehman. Now the scientists turned their eyes to Sagittarius. They tuned their ears, again and again, to the coordinates where the signal had appeared. The printouts kept coming. Numbers, letters, endless code rolling out of the machine like a heartbeat with no variation. Hour after hour, night after night, the telescope listened. And the universe said nothing. The silence grew heavier with each passing night. You can imagine the frustration. Astronomers hunched over desks with coffee gone cold, eyes burning from the dim glow of green-tinted screens. They debated quietly, then loudly, each convinced of a different explanation. Some argued it was interference from Earth, a military satellite perhaps, or a stray radar bouncing off the ionosphere. But tests showed the frequency was too perfect, too clean. Others proposed a comet, releasing hydrogen in a narrow band. But when they checked the star charts, the comets were nowhere near Sagittarius that night in 1977. The explanations frayed one by one. What made the signal so remarkable was its exact position in the spectrum. It came almost precisely at 1420 megahertz, the natural emission frequency of hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. Hydrogen is the alphabet of the stars, the simplest atom, the building block of galaxies. For decades, theorists had suggested that if intelligent beings wanted to broadcast across the cosmos, they would use that frequency. It was the one constant that every astronomer on every possible world would understand. And the wow signal had spoken in hydrogen's voice. Imagine being one of those scientists, sitting at your desk, holding the printout with the red circle drawn by Ehman's hand, knowing that if it was what it seemed to be, then you were staring at the most important communication in human history. And yet, you had only one copy, one moment, one fragile 72-second breath. Journalists soon caught wind of the story. By late summer, headlines asked, "Signal from the stars?" and "Are we alone no more?" The public was thrilled. For decades, the question of extraterrestrial life had been the domain of science fiction, pulp magazines, and late-night radio shows. But now it was real, printed in newspapers, debated in classrooms. People imagined civilizations far away, beaming signals into the dark, waiting for us to hear. The scientists were more cautious. Astronomy is a discipline of patience. A discovery is nothing unless it can be repeated, tested, confirmed. And the wow signal offered nothing of the kind. They pointed telescopes again and again to Sagittarius. They asked other observatories across the world to join the search. They waited through seasons, through years, through decades. The signal never returned. Jerry Ehman himself refused to claim what so many wanted him to. In interviews, he called it an interesting anomaly, but not proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. He reminded people that science is not built on single events, but there was something in his handwriting, in that one spontaneous word scrawled in red ink that betrayed him. Wow was not the language of caution, it was the language of wonder. The silence that followed was almost more profound than the signal itself. If it had been random, surely it would appear again. If it had been natural, comets or pulsars or some cosmic echo, surely a telescope somewhere would catch its twin. But in the long years since 1977, nothing has matched it. And so, the wow signal became not just a scientific puzzle, but a cultural ghost. It appeared in documentaries, in novels, in songs. UFO enthusiasts pointed to it as evidence of alien greetings. Skeptics dismissed it as noise. Scientists filed it under unexplained. But in the quiet hours of night, when the big ear stood alone under the stars, one could not help but imagine. Consider this. Hydrogen is universal. The wow signal's frequency was not chosen by chance. If someone wanted to say, "We are here," they could do no better than to speak in the voice of hydrogen. And if they did, then for 72 seconds, humanity heard them. But why only once? Was it all they had the power to send? A single spark across the void? Was it an accident? A transmission never meant for us? Or was it deliberate? A single knock on the cosmic door, just enough to remind us we are not alone, but not enough to change the course of our world. As the years passed and the silence deepened, that question grew heavier. In the vast emptiness of the cosmos, the wow signal was a fleeting echo, but sometimes echoes carry more power than voices. Sometimes one whisper is enough to shake the silence of an entire planet. And so, late at night, astronomers still glance at the coordinates in Sagittarius. They still scan the sky. They still wait. And perhaps, somewhere in the darkness, another signal waits too, ready, one day, to answer. But what if the true mystery is not why it came once, but why it never came again? By the time the world first read about the wow signal, the astronomers at Ohio State had already grown used to the silence that followed it. They had pointed the big ear again and again towards Sagittarius, searching for the same sharp frequency, hoping for repetition. But all they received was the endless cosmic static. To scientists, it was a puzzle. To the wider world, it was something else entirely, a spark of possibility that would not be easily contained. The story broke in local newspapers first. A strange radio burst had been detected, lasting just over a minute, its precision too sharp to be dismissed. Reporters loved the human detail, the astronomers' red pen circling numbers and letters and scrawling a single astonished word. Wow! Within weeks the story spread, carried by national magazines, late-night radio shows, and eventually television. Suddenly people everywhere were talking about aliens again. For those who had grown up in the 1950s, it was familiar ground. That was the decade when flying saucers had filled the headlines, when the Cold War and science fiction blurred into one fever of fear and hope. But the wow signal was different. This was not a farmer's tale of lights in the sky, or a blurry photograph of a disc-shaped shadow. This was science, raw and technical, a sequence of characters printed by a machine, stamped by mathematics, and circled by an astronomer's careful hand. UFO enthusiasts seized on it instantly. Here, at last, was the proof they had been waiting for. A message, deliberate and clear. They imagined civilizations across the stars, sending greetings to us, testing the waters of our awareness. Some even claimed that the signal had been covered up, that scientists knew more than they were telling. In dusty bookstores and community halls, in whispered conversations on shortwave radios, the wow signal became a mythic cornerstone, as solid in their minds as Roswell or Area 51. Meanwhile, in universities and research centers, the debate took a different form. Could it really have been extraterrestrial? Why only once? Why no repeat? Why no follow-up? Theories multiplied. Each conference brought new speculations. Yet the lack of evidence weighed heavily. Scientists are trained to distrust one-off anomalies. They wanted data, replication, second chances. The wow signal gave them none. But absence does not silence imagination. In living rooms across America, families tuned their televisions to science specials where animated galaxies spun across screens, and narrators asked, "What if we are not alone?" Children lay awake staring at ceilings, wondering if somewhere far away, eyes just like theirs gazed up at a sky and wondered about us. The signal had become more than a scientific mystery. It was cultural poetry. Philosophers weighed in as well. For centuries, thinkers had asked whether we were unique in the cosmos, whether life bloomed only on this one pale dot. The wow signal was tantalizing because it suggested both an answer and no answer at all. It was like a knock on a door with no one standing outside when you opened it. What is more haunting, the possibility that it was aliens, or the possibility that we heard something extraordinary once and will never hear it again? NASA and SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, found themselves in an odd position. On one hand, they were thrilled. The wow signal brought public interest, funding, excitement. On the other, they were cautious, wary of promising too much. They reminded the world again and again that science needs repetition, that one signal cannot be considered proof. But the public rarely hears such cautions. People hear only the whisper of wonder. For Jerry Ehman, the sudden attention was uncomfortable. He had been a quiet researcher, not one to chase the spotlight. Yet now he was being asked in interviews whether he thought aliens had spoken to us. He answered carefully, reminding everyone that it might have been a natural phenomenon or interference. But each time he said the words, the memory of circling those numbers, the thrill in his chest as he wrote, "Wow," came back. Even he could not escape it. Imagine how those words must have sounded late at night, whispered across kitchen tables, spoken softly in dorm rooms where young students dreamed of galaxies. The wow signal was the closest thing to contact humanity had ever felt, and it entered the bloodstream of culture. It appeared in novels, inspiring tales of interstellar civilizations sending brief hellos. It found its way into music, sampled as static and melody. It became a symbol, not just of science, but of longing, the human hunger to not be alone. The irony is that its power came not from what it proved, but from what it did not. The wow signal was not a conversation. It was a question left unanswered. And unanswered questions have a way of growing larger in our imaginations than clear truths ever could. Over the years, more powerful telescopes searched the same sky. The silence endured. New generations of scientists studied the data, ran simulations, tested hypotheses. But the mystery held. The wow signal never repeated. And so it drifted out of the hands of science and into the realm of cultural legend. Somewhere between the laboratory and the imagination, it transformed. For some, it became proof. For others, it was just noise. For all, it was unforgettable. And perhaps that is what makes it endure. Not because it told us the truth, but because it gave us permission to wonder. A reminder that even if we are surrounded by silence, the universe is not empty of possibility. Still, the haunting question remains. If someone truly did speak to us in 1977, why have they never spoken again? By the early 1980s, the wow signal had taken on two parallel lives. In popular imagination, it had become a beacon, a possible hello from distant intelligence. In the halls of academia, however, it remained a stubborn anomaly, perched uneasily between data and mystery. Scientists hate loose ends, and the wow signal was the loosest end of all. The Ohio State University Radio Observatory, where the Big Ear listened night after night, became a place of quiet obsession. Graduate students pored over the data, senior astronomers argued in clipped voices, and engineers checked the telescope systems again and again. Each new night brought the same ritual, the telescope sweeping across Sagittarius, the printers humming, the endless code rolling across fresh sheets of paper. Each new morning brought the same result. Nothing. The silence was almost cruel. If the wow signal had been interference, perhaps from a military satellite or an Earth-based transmission, then it should have been traceable. Engineers ran models, checking orbital paths, calculating possible echoes. None matched. If it had been a comet, as some would later propose, then comets should have left a signature at other times, in other places. They did not. Scientists debated natural sources. Pulsars, those whirling corpses of stars that beam radiation like celestial lighthouses, were considered, but pulsars repeat with perfect regularity, and this signal did not. Quasars, galaxies with cores blazing brighter than 1 billion suns, produce torrents of noise, but never so narrow and precise. Even the vast hydrogen clouds that drift between stars could not explain it. They sing in broader tones, spread across the spectrum. The wow signal was sharp, like the note of a single instrument in a cosmic orchestra. The more theories failed, the more the mystery grew, and with mystery came frustration. To a scientist, a mystery is not romance. It is an irritant, like a splinter under the skin. Every conference brought the question. Every paper that mentioned the wow signal had to bow its head and admit ignorance. For Jerry Ehman, the man who had circled those fateful characters, the attention was uncomfortable. He had not sought fame. He wanted answers, and the answers refused to come. By 1985, SETI itself was in a delicate position. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence was gaining momentum with new projects, better equipment, and crucially, public funding. But funding depends on credibility, and credibility suffers when scientists appear too enchanted by whispers and wonders. The wow signal, with its allure and its silence, threatened to blur the line between disciplined research and the kind of speculation that draws laughter in congressional halls. And so SETI walked a careful path. They acknowledged the signal, but they did not claim it. They reminded the world again and again that science is built not on single events, but on replication, on patterns, on proof. The wow signal had none of these. It was a solitary spike on a graph, a single thread in an otherwise empty tapestry. Yet in the quiet of the observatory, some scientists admitted to one another what they would not say in journals. It had felt different. They remembered the sharpness of the frequency, the uncanny coincidence of its alignment with hydrogen's universal voice, the sheer improbability of its strength. It was as though the cosmos had opened a door just wide enough for us to glimpse a hallway beyond, then closed it again before we could step through. Meanwhile, skeptics sharpened their knives. Some claimed the signal was simple interference, no different than the countless false alarms detected over the years. Others dismissed it as statistical noise, a random fluctuation dressed in the appearance of meaning. To them, the wow written in the margin was nothing more than a human projection, a moment of enthusiasm mistaken for significance. And still, the wow signal refused to vanish. It stayed in archives, in footnotes, in whispered late-night conversations between students who leaned too far into wonder. It remained stubbornly in the silence. Imagine, for a moment, the scene at the Big Ear in those years. The telescope's enormous reflectors catching starlight as well as radio waves, glowing faintly under Ohio's winter skies. Inside, a graduate student hunched over a desk, hair unkempt, the smell of ink and dust filling the air. Each printout felt like a lottery ticket. each night a roll of the dice. The dream of hearing that voice again kept them awake through the long hours. But the universe remained mute. The wow signal became both proof and paradox. Proof because it had happened, paradox because it never happened again. By the end of the decade, some scientists began to suggest a darker thought. Perhaps it really was a message, and perhaps it was never meant to be repeated. What if it was like a lighthouse seen once through fog, a warning or a greeting, but fleeting by design? What if the silence that followed was the answer, a deliberate refusal to speak again? The scientific journals would not print such thoughts, but in quiet hallways and sleepless nights, the question lingered. A single signal is enough to prove possibility, but a single signal is not enough to explain intent. And so, the wow signal settled into its strange place in history, too sharp to dismiss, too fleeting to prove, a ghost in the records, a red circle on yellowed paper, a whisper no one could forget. But what if that whisper was not meant for us at all? As the 1980s unfolded, the wow signal refused to fade into obscurity. It lived in the margins of journals, in quiet debates at conferences, in late-night conversations between astronomers who didn't want to admit how much it haunted them. But outside Ohio, the mystery began to take on a global life of its own. Other observatories, other telescopes, other ears turned toward the stars, all of them straining for a second whisper, a repeat, something that could prove or disprove the fleeting 72 seconds from 1977. In Puerto Rico, the massive Arecibo Observatory, the largest radio telescope in the world at the time, was listening. Its dish, a bowl longer than 3 football fields, rested in a natural sinkhole surrounded by jungle. It was a cathedral of listening, so sensitive it could detect the faintest murmurs from deep space. If the wow signal had been real, if it had any intention of repeating, Arecibo would surely catch it. Night after night, teams of scientists pointed its ear towards Sagittarius, programming long sessions to stare at the coordinates of the mysterious burst. In Australia, the Parkes Radio Telescope, famous for its role in transmitting the first images of Apollo 11's moon landing, also turned its attention skyward. It had heard quasars, pulsars, storms from the sun itself, but from Sagittarius, in that frequency of hydrogen, there was only emptiness. It became a pattern repeated across the globe. Telescopes in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, all tuned their instruments to the cosmic channel where the wow signal had spoken. For months, then years, they waited. The skies remained mute. Some scientists began to feel mocked by it. A signal so perfect should not vanish. It was like hearing a knock at the door, opening it, and finding only shadows. Theories multiplied again. Some proposed that the signal had been aimed deliberately, a narrow beam that happened to sweep across Earth once, never to pass again. Others wondered if it was a cosmic accident, a natural event of extraordinary rarity, never to be repeated in human lifetimes. Meanwhile, the public fascination only grew. Magazines with glossy covers ran headlines like "Message from the Stars" and "Alien Transmission Detected." The words were careful, always ending with question marks, always hedging. But the implication was irresistible. To a culture steeped in science fiction, the wow signal felt like the prologue to a story still waiting to be told. For the scientists, it was agony. They could not dismiss it, but they could not confirm it either. Each time funding agencies met, each time skeptics raised eyebrows, the wow signal was dragged out like a guest who had overstayed its welcome. What about replication? Critics asked. What about evidence? And the researchers could only shake their heads. They had nothing but silence. Still, the search continued. New computers were introduced, able to analyze data far more quickly than the paper printouts of the Big Ear era. Algorithms were written to scan vast swathes of sky, to detect the faintest anomalies. SETI began to expand beyond Ohio, branching into coordinated efforts. In California, the NASA Ames Research Center started building new tools for the search. The vision was no longer just one observatory listening, but a network, a global ear. The wow signal had become both a curse and a catalyst. A curse because it had no answer, a catalyst because it drove the creation of new methods, new machines, new dreams. In Ohio, the big ear itself carried on, still sweeping, still listening, though its days were numbered. By the 1990s, the land it occupied would be sold and the telescope dismantled. But in those years after 1977, it became a shrine of sorts. Scientists and visitors alike walked beneath its vast panels and thought of the night when the stars had seemed to speak. Consider the feeling of standing there, the metal groaning in the wind, the sky stretching endlessly overhead. Somewhere in those stars, perhaps, was the source of the signal. Perhaps a planet circling a sun, its inhabitants sending their voice into the void, hoping it might be heard. Perhaps they knew we were listening. Perhaps they had moved on. The irony was cruel. Technology was improving, computers growing faster, telescopes more sensitive. And still, the one thing everyone wanted, a second signal, a reply, never came. The universe kept its silence, as if mocking the very hunger that had driven us to listen. Silence has its own kind of power. It does not extinguish mystery. It deepens it. Every year that passed without another wow signal only made the original more mythic. It became the heartbeat of SETI, the single reminder that listening was not in vain. If the universe had spoken once, it could speak again. And so, the world's ears remained open, waiting, listening. And astronomers asked themselves a question they rarely spoke aloud. What if the wow signal had been genuine, but fleeting? What if it was all we were ever meant to have? By the early 1990s, the big ear had already outlived its time. When it was first constructed, it had been a marvel, not elegant like an optical telescope with gleaming domes and polished mirrors, but powerful in its own way, a raw machine for listening. For decades, it swept the skies and gave astronomers data that fueled studies of quasars, galaxies, and of course, that one unforgettable signal. But like all machines, it was vulnerable not just to age, but to the shifting priorities of the world around it. The land where the big ear stood had become valuable. Developers eyed it for expansion, for golf courses, for profit. To them, it was nothing more than metal and weeds sprawled across prime real estate in Ohio. To the scientists, it was a cathedral. Every girder, every panel, every bolt seemed to echo with the memory of the night when the stars had spoken. They pleaded, wrote letters, organized campaigns. But funding was scarce, and the world's attention had drifted elsewhere. By 1997, the decision was final. The big ear would be dismantled. Piece by piece, the telescope that had listened to the cosmos for so long was taken apart. The panels came down, the towers were toppled, the control rooms emptied. Where once radio waves had whispered across steel, bulldozers and construction crews filled the air with dust and noise. Imagine being one of the astronomers who had given years of their life to that place, standing in the field as the last sections were lowered, knowing that the machine which had caught the wow signal would never listen again. For them, it must have felt like tearing pages from a book that could never be rewritten. But the memory remained. The wow signal itself had already outgrown the big ear. It had become something larger, a legend in astronomy, a puzzle carried in the hearts of those who had studied it. The telescope was gone, but the red circle on Jerry Ehman's printout, the word wow, scribbled in the margin, could not be bulldozed. It was etched into history. In the years that followed, new telescopes rose. Arecibo in Puerto Rico, Parkes in Australia, the Allen Telescope Array in California. They all carried the torch. They all listened, day and night, hoping to catch another anomaly. And while each had its triumphs, none of them ever captured a signal with the same haunting clarity. The wow signal remained unique, untouchable. The dismantling of the big ear marked the end of an era, but it also solidified the legend. For astronomers, it became a symbol of fragility, how easily the tools of discovery can be lost to economics, how quickly the pursuit of wonder can be pushed aside by the pursuit of profit. For dreamers, it became a ghost story, the haunted field in Ohio where the stars once whispered and then fell silent forever. Standing there today on what has become manicured grass and quiet pathways, you would never know that a mystery once unfolded there. The wind carries no memory of radio waves. The ground does not tremble with cosmic whispers. And yet, if you close your eyes, perhaps you can still imagine the giant panels stretched across the field, the long cables humming, the sound of the printer spitting out the code that changed everything. It is said that the past does not vanish. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the hearts of those who remember. And perhaps, just perhaps, the universe itself remembers too. The big ear is gone, but the wow signal lives on, a reminder that the cosmos has spoken once and may speak again. But if the universe truly whispered to us, was dismantling our ear a mistake? When the last beams of the big ear were hauled away, many assumed the story of the wow signal would fade with it. After all, science is a discipline of the present and the future, not of nostalgia. Yet, strangely, the dismantling of the telescope did not silence the legend. It amplified it. Freed from its steel cradle, the wow signal began to live a second life, not only in science, but in culture, art, and the fertile soil of imagination. By the late 1990s, the phrase wow signal had spread far beyond academic journals. It was whispered on late-night radio shows, written into novels, and cited in documentaries that played to hushed audiences. The word itself, wow, was irresistibly human. It captured the astonishment of discovery in 3 letters. For believers, it was proof that the stars had once spoken. For skeptics, it was a reminder of how easily humans can project wonder onto noise. SETI researchers pressed on. But even as they built new instruments and refined their methods, the wow signal lingered like a ghost. Every time a funding committee met, the question arose, had we not already heard something once? Every time a new telescope switched on, the hope was whispered. Perhaps this time, the stars will repeat themselves. But the repetition never came. Instead, the signal evolved into myth. Science fiction authors wrote of alien civilizations sending one message across the void, a breadcrumb left for humanity to follow. Poets spoke of it as a cosmic sigh. Musicians sampled the data, turning static into rhythm, transforming science into sound. And on the internet, which was beginning to knit the world together in new ways, the signal became part of a digital folklore. People argued in forums late at night, trading theories. Was it a message, a mistake, a miracle? With myth came conspiracy. Some claimed the truth of the wow signal had been hidden, that Ehman had known more than he admitted, that the government had buried follow-up detections. None of these claims held water, but they spread because mysteries crave fuel. A single unanswered question is enough to light 1,000 stories. And so the wow signal took root in the popular imagination. It became not just an anomaly, but a mirror. To those who feared loneliness in the cosmos, it was a comfort. We are not alone. To those who mistrust authority, it was a symbol of secrecy. To scientists, it was an irritant wrapped in allure. Jerry Ehman, for his part, kept to humility. In interviews, even decades later, he would remind listeners that the signal might have been terrestrial interference, that it could still be explained away. Yet when asked if he believed it might have been more, he hesitated. That hesitation, that pause, said more than his caution ever could. Consider the paradox. If the wow signal had repeated, it might have become just another data set, catalogued, studied, explained. Instead, by refusing to return, it slipped from science into legend. It became one of the great cultural mysteries of the 20th century, not because of what it was, but because of what it refused to be. Even today, artists paint it, filmmakers dramatize it, musicians weave it into their soundscapes. The signal that lasted only 72 seconds has lasted for decades in human memory. Its endurance is proof of something deeper, that humans hunger for mystery, that we are drawn to the unknown. that silence can be as powerful as speech. And so the wow signal survived its machine. The big ear may have been dismantled, but the story it captured continues. It echoes not through radio waves now, but through culture, imagination, and wonder. But perhaps the deeper mystery is this. If the universe gave us one story, one single signal, what else has it given that we fail to notice? In the years after the big ear fell silent and its field grew grass again, a strange thing happened. The very absence that frustrated astronomers began to pull them forward. The wow signal was not a door that opened. It was the sensation of a key brushing the palm, proof that a lock exists. Across deserts, mountains, and valleys, new instruments rose, their metal ribs catching morning light, their cables humming like taut strings. The project changed names and budgets, teams formed and dissolved, but the intention remained faithful. Listen, and learn to listen better. On a cold dawn in the high desert of Northern California, dishes of the Allen Telescope Array tilt together like a flock of white birds coming to rest. Frost evaporates from aluminum skins. Cables warm. Servers start their slow conversation in machine voices, spinning disks and moving bits. Here the sky feels larger than elsewhere, so wide that the blue itself looks like a sea. Engineers in parkas walk the gravel between antennas, cradling coffee, eyes flicking from horizon to signal monitors. Someone runs a quick diagnostic, a green line holds steady, and the array begins its day's sweep. They hunt not for the noise of the universe, but for patterns inside the noise, slender signals, tonal islands, the narrow places where intention might live. Far away in West Virginia, a single giant listens from a bowl of forest. The Green Bank Telescope, white and angular against a quilt of firs. Deep in the control room, the air smells faintly of electronics and paper dust. Screens show spectra like rain. A technician whispers to another the way people whisper in museums and cathedrals. In the silence of that valley, the telescope's slow movements feel like thought, deliberate, careful, reverent. When the dish pauses on a target, a star known to hold planets, the room draws breath. Human time condenses to the length of one exposure. Somewhere in that moment, a heartbeat aligns with a graph, and the work feels almost personal. Elsewhere, new ideas bloom. If radio is one way to speak across a galaxy, light may be another. Optical SETI searches for sharp bursts, laser pulses that would flare and vanish faster than a human blink, but clearly betray design. A photomultiplier, cooled and listening, records darkness as a number and waits for a number that is not darkness. Years pass that way. A spike rises. False alarm. Another spike. Instrument glitch. A third spike. Airplane, satellite, lightning reflected from nothing in particular. The data erase themselves, but the learning remains. Next time, better filters. Next time, a tandem telescope to cross-check. Next time, another fragment of silence disciplined into a useful tool. The silence itself becomes an instructor. Teams build software that does not tire and does not dream. Algorithms sift torrents of sky. Neural nets are trained on synthetic signals until they recognize patterns that no human eye could hold in one look. Interference from microwave ovens, cell towers, satellites, aircraft, things that once drowned the faintest possibilities, are labeled, sorted, dismissed. The search stops being a single ear and becomes something like a nervous system, 100 ears linked by a spine of code. At home, on millions of screens, a different kind of constellation glows. SETI home. Dorm rooms, kitchen tables, IT closets, offices after hours. Silicon volunteers form a global supercomputer made of generosity. A student in Sao Paulo leaves a laptop open all night. Somewhere in Warsaw, a server hums during lunch. A school in Manila sets up 10 machines the week before exams and forgets to turn them off. Through this choir of quiet machines pours the sky. Packets arrive, are chewed, are sent back with small verdicts. Noise, noise, noise. This too is a kind of faith, the willingness to do a small thing, a long time, for a possibility that may never return the favor. The search learns humility, and range. Not every beacon must be deliberate. Techno-signatures, signs of technology rather than messages, enter the vocabulary. Could leaking radio from a distant world wash through our antennas like a faint tide? Could an exoplanet's night side hold a glow pattern that only cities make? Might chemicals in a planet's sky tell of machines, mines, harvests, engines? The question stretches from radio to light to atmosphere to heat. The net grows wide. Astronomy, meanwhile, hands the search a new map. Kepler and Tess change the sky from a scatter of maybe worlds to a registry of thousands. Stars once anonymous earn biographies. Distance, size, temperature. A family of attendant planets, some small and rocky, some fat with gas, some circling in the comfortable band where water can remain water. A file opens on a star whose planets tug on one another like children in a crowded room. Another file marks a world with a year measured in days, bright and close to its sun. The lists become targets, and targets become nights. Inside conference halls, the conversation deepens. The Drake equation's variables, once guesses, acquire numbers with edges. How many stars? Easy. How many with planets? Many. How many with Earth-sized planets in the Goldilocks zone? Fewer, but not few. How many worlds where life arises, where intelligence blooms, where technology reaches for the sky? Those numbers remain fog, and in the fog, a paradox walks. We call it Fermi's. If the galaxy is so fertile, where is everyone? On whiteboards, trees branch, colonization timescales, ethical refusals to interfere, civilizations turning inward, catastrophes that silence worlds. In a corner of one board, someone writes a single word and draws a thin circle around it. Patience. Not everyone agrees on listening. Some argue for speaking. METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. If we have ears, let us also have a mouth. Compose a greeting. Be brave. Be honest. Others argue for caution. We do not know the nature of strangers. We do not know their stories. We do not know the price of being noticed. This debate, polite but edged, runs through the years like a fault line. A letter circulates, signed by those who prefer to listen longer. Another letter answers. Great voyages require a sail. The telescopes keep their counsel. They do not speak. They receive. The work acquires rituals. Before a candidate's signal can graduate from rumor to result, a checklist unfurls. Verify with a second instrument. Pivot the dish away and back to test if the source follows the sky. Confirm that the frequency does not drift as human machines drift. Call a partner facility on another continent and ask them to look now, quickly, before the Earth turns the chance away. Most candidates die on that list. The ones that survive go to committees. The ones that survive committees go to papers. The ones that survive papers enter the law and sometimes return, years later, as solved crosswords, natural but little known. The remainder, those that neither repeat nor resolve, end up in a drawer labeled not with certainty but with patience. Through it all runs the memory of a single printout with red pencil in the margin. It becomes a quiet blessing and a discipline. When a new graduate student stands at a console for the first time, a senior scientist might nod at the wall where a framed copy hangs. The message is not nostalgia, but calibration. We have heard one thing that changed us, it says. So build the tools that deserve a second. On a windless evening at Greenbank, a small team gathers to change targets to an exoplanet system recently found to host a rocky world. The dish moves with the grace of a crane, lifting water from a river. Someone runs a final RFI scan. Someone else calls a timestamp. The interface flickers, settles, and then becomes the quietest painting imaginable, the spectrum of nothing. A hand hovers above a keyboard as if it could coax the sky. No one speaks. A fox crosses the road outside, red against the grass, untroubled by galaxies. Minutes become hours. The data scroll. The dish slews to a second star, then a third. The night chooses to be only a night. There is a small sadness in that, and a greater steadiness. This is what listening looks like when wonder becomes work. In the high desert, the array works a different rhythm. Multiple targets, multiple beams, 1,000 slices of sky at once. Somewhere in the racks, a drive fails and is replaced. Somewhere in the code, a bug is found and mended. Someone writes a new classifier and names it after a bird because it listens for short songs. On a whiteboard, a diagram shows a plan to combine radio and optical and infrared in a dance that will make false positive ghosts step into the light where they can be dismissed. Every improvement is small. The smallness becomes a staircase. The world outside the domes and dishes changes shape. Budgets rise and fall. A great observatory far away collapses into itself and becomes a ruin. New facilities bloom in the Karoo, in the outback, on high plateaus where the air holds less water and more stars. In control rooms, the floor plans differ, but the posture is the same, someone leaning toward a screen as if proximity could draw a signal closer. The rooms share a vocabulary too: bandpass, drift rate, narrowband, techno-signature, and they share a silence that is not defeat but discipline. At home, the volunteer supercomputer keeps purring. An office light stays on in a quiet building late into the night, and the security guard walking his rounds notices the soft fan sound behind a door where no one sits. He pauses, listens, and moves on, unaware that inside the dark room, a processor just discarded a little square of sky that looked messy in the wrong way. On a kitchen table, a retired teacher reads an article about a new exoplanet and smiles because her old laptop will nibble at that star next week while she sleeps. The search is made of instruments, but it is also made of people who will accept long odds with good grace. A philosophy grows from that acceptance. Perhaps we are early, perhaps we are late. Perhaps messages are common, but the method is wrong. Perhaps messages are rare, and we hold one of the few in our archives without knowing how to read it. Perhaps the act of listening changes us more than any reply could, teaches precision, patience, humility, solidarity. In an era when many signals are crafted to sell, flatter, divide, there is a quiet oddness in a community that trains itself to hear without assuming it will be heard back. On some evenings, the work yields unlooked-for gifts. A search for beacons discovers a new kind of pulsar. A campaign aimed at a sun-like star records a burst from a magnetar half a galaxy away. A string of fast radio bursts is pinned to a dwarf galaxy after months of watching. None of these are voices, but all are lessons. The pursuit of company teaches more about the household we already live in. What, then, remains of the signal that started this surge? Not numbers on paper alone, not the red ink like a flare. What remains is an ethic, the wow. Signal convinced a generation that the faintest might be the most important, that attention is a form of respect, that patience is not passive but muscular. It taught the difference between fantasy and wonder. Fantasy invents. Wonder observes and refuses to turn away when the answer is not quick. There is a kind of night when even the computers seem to rest, when the logs show only normal behavior, when the stars outside the window look close enough to touch. On such a night, someone stepping out for air will stand a long time and listen with ears instead of antennas. The crickets carry on. A breeze passes through pine. A train horn ghosts the valley from 20 miles away. In that layering of distances and times, a thought occurs unprovoked. If we cannot hear every sound on our own planet, how easily we could miss a whisper from a sky full of planets. The thought is not discouragement, it is instruction. Build better ears. The movement that took shape from one brief signal is not a line, but a braid. Instruments, code, patience, people. It does not guarantee contact, it guarantees readiness. Tomorrow, the receivers will cool, the arrays will swing, the graphs will refill with rain. And if nothing arrives, the day after will look the same, and the day after that. The work is a vow, to be in the room when the unknown chooses a voice. If the universe intends to speak only seldom, will we recognize the next syllable when it comes? The wow! Signal was only 72 seconds long, but by the turn of the new millennium, it had stretched into decades of speculation, debate, and fascination. It lived not just in dusty archives, but in classrooms, living rooms, online forums, and observatories around the world. The printout was yellowing, the red circle fading, and Jerry Ehman's hand had long since moved on to other work. But the question it raised refused to go silent. In the scientific community, the wow signal had become a paradoxical presence. On one hand, it was a reminder of possibility, a piece of data so sharp, so unusual that it could not be dismissed. On the other, it was an irritant, a puzzle without a solution, forever lingering at the edge of credibility. Astronomers who had grown up with the story inherited it like an heirloom they could not sell, polish, or discard. It was there, haunting them in conference halls, slipping into the margins of grant proposals, whispered in quiet exchanges at the end of long meetings. Has anything else ever looked like that? The answer was almost always no. Still, the signal refused to die. Artists and writers seized it, reshaping the sterile numbers into something mythic. In a Brooklyn studio, a painter spread oils across canvas, reimagining 6EQUJ5 as runes etched in starlight, glyphs floating across galaxies. In a music lab in Berlin, a composer sampled the raw frequency, bending it into a low hum that swelled into symphonies of static and harmony, as if turning mathematics into music. For poets, it became a metaphor. The universe whispered once and then withdrew, leaving humanity to sit in its silence. Teachers, too, used it. In classrooms across the world, chalkboards carried the story of August 15, 1977. Students listened wide-eyed as teachers explained how a telescope in Ohio might have overheard aliens. The details mattered less than the possibility. Children leaned forward, imaginations burning with the idea that a message could travel across light years and be caught by human machines, only to vanish again. In those classrooms, the wow signal planted seeds. Then came the internet. In the 1990s, forums filled with speculation, each thread a tug-of-war between skeptics and dreamers. Some argued the signal was interference, a fluke dressed up by coincidence. Others swore it was proof of contact hidden by governments. Conspiracies spread like wildfire. Ehman had known more than he said. SETI had confirmed the signal and buried the truth. The silence was itself an answer. None of these claims held evidence, but in the digital night, evidence mattered less than the hunger to believe. Jerry Ehman lived long enough to see this transformation. He remained cautious to the end, a man bound by scientific discipline. It might still have been terrestrial interference, he would remind reporters. But when asked if he believed it could have been more, he hesitated. That hesitation became as telling as his words. He had circled those characters in red, not with caution, but with awe. And awe does not fade easily. For SETI, the wow signal became both a shield and a burden. Every time funding was debated, it returned as justification. We have heard something. Once, therefore, we must keep listening. And yet it was also ammunition for skeptics. One signal in decades and nothing since. Isn't that proof of futility? The signal hovered over every conversation, neither blessing nor curse, but both. Meanwhile, the search evolved. The Allen Telescope Array rose from the desert in California, a forest of small dishes working together. SETI Home turned ordinary laptops into a global network of ears, millions of people donating processing power to scan fragments of sky. New algorithms combed through torrents of data, teaching themselves to recognize patterns no human eye could catch. Each improvement, each innovation, carried within it the ghost of 1977. The memory that once the stars had seemed to speak. Philosophers began to write about the signal in new ways. The question was no longer only are we alone, but why? Would someone speak once and never again? Some argued the silence was itself the message, a demonstration of existence without an invitation to converse. Others proposed that the signal was accidental, a leak from a world unaware of us. Still others suggested something more haunting. What if the civilization that sent it no longer existed? What if the wow signal was not a greeting but an echo? The wow signal thus became a mirror. For scientists, it reflected the hunger for proof. For artists, it reflected the beauty of mystery. For philosophers, it reflected the fragility of life. For ordinary people, it reflected the desire not to be alone. And always, behind it all, there was silence. Decades of silence. More powerful, telescopes searched the same skies. Computers 1,000,000 times faster devoured the data. And still the silence stretched on, vast and unbroken. But silence, too, has power. It turns single events into legends. It allows mystery to bloom. The wow signal did not endure because of what it was. It endured because of what it refused to be. It was not explained. It was not repeated. It was not forgotten. And in that gap, it became more than a signal. It became a story. The story of a universe that may have spoken once. The story of humanity listening still. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if the universe truly speaks only once in a century, will we still be listening the next time? The wow signal was only 72 seconds long, a brief rise and fall in radio intensity, and yet by the late 20th century, it had become a question that shadowed every search for life beyond Earth. If the galaxy is filled with billions of stars and billions of worlds, then where is everybody? The silence that followed the signal was louder than the signal itself, and in that silence, scientists, philosophers, and dreamers alike began to wrestle with the paradox of our solitude. The idea had been framed decades earlier by the physicist Enrico Fermi. One afternoon in 1950, at a Los Alamos lunch table, he posed the question that still echoes today. Where is everybody? If life is common, intelligent civilizations should spread through the galaxy, colonizing stars, sending probes, broadcasting signals. In the span of cosmic time, even a modest civilization should leave fingerprints everywhere. And yet, when we listen, we hear nothing. When we look, we see nothing. The universe is vast, old, and silent. The wow signal inserted itself like a jagged note into that silence. For some, it was the exception that proved Fermi wrong. Here was evidence, however fleeting, that we are not alone. For others, it deepened the paradox. How cruel that we might have heard something once and never again. The difference between infinite silence and one unanswered whisper is small in physics, but enormous in human imagination. In observatories across the world, young astronomers face this paradox as part of their initiation. At Greenbank, a mentor would scrawl the Drake equation across a chalkboard: N R X FP X NE X FL X FO X FC X L, each term a variable, each variable a gate between ignorance and possibility. R, the rate of star formation. FP, the fraction with planets. Ni, the number of Earth-like worlds. FL, the likelihood of life. Phi, the chance of intelligence. FC, the fraction that develops technology. And L, the lifetime of civilizations, the wild card, the unknowable number. The room always grew still at that last variable. How long does intelligence survive? How long do civilizations last? The wow signal was like a single data point hovering in the middle of that equation, suggesting existence but telling nothing of survival. Philosophers began to write essays about what the silence meant. Some argued that civilizations do not broadcast endlessly. Perhaps they whisper briefly and then stop. Perhaps they cloak themselves deliberately, fearing predators. Perhaps they move inward, building digital worlds so rich that the physical universe no longer interests them. Perhaps life arises often, but intelligence destroys itself quickly, leaving ruins, echoes, ghosts. Others framed it more darkly. Maybe civilizations do reach outward, but the galaxy is littered with their failures. The wow signal might not have been a greeting at all. It could have been an echo, a remnant, the last flare from a culture already gone. A voice traveling the void long after the mouth that spoke it had turned to dust. For poets, the signal became a metaphor of loneliness. They compared it to a lighthouse flash across a stormy ocean, seen once and then gone forever. Or to a knock at a door we opened too late. Or to the cry of a traveler lost in a canyon, the sound reaching us only after the voice had already fallen silent. For scientists, the paradox was maddening but galvanizing. They built better instruments, refined algorithms, forged collaborations across continents. They did not accept the silence as permanent. Every new telescope was a reply to Fermi's question. Every new survey a defiance of despair. The wow signal was their reminder that even the quietest universe can surprise. The paradox did not stay in academia. It seeped into culture, into novels, films, late-night talk shows. Science fiction picked it up and made it myth. Movies imagined the wow signal as a countdown, a warning, a cipher. Books reimagined it as a deliberate breadcrumb, a clue to a cosmic riddle. Television turned it into a plot device, blending science with drama, weaving awe with dread. Even people who never read a scientific journal knew of the strange night in 1977, when the stars may have spoken once and only once. At the heart of it all was silence, stubborn, immense, unbroken. Silence was the real teacher. It pressed humility into the work of astronomers. It shaped the methods of data analysis, forcing rigor where dreams alone would blur. It fueled imagination in culture, giving artists a void to fill. The wow signal was extraordinary, not because it solved the silence, but because it reminded us that silence itself is part of the answer. Imagine the scene in a modern control room, decades after the big ear was dismantled. The glow of monitors, the faint hum of servers, the quiet rustle of papers. An astronomer sits alone at 3 a.m, running a scan of a star system where a rocky exoplanet circles in the habitable zone. The data scrolls across the screen like rain. Nothing stands out. No spike, no beacon, no whisper. The astronomer leans back, rubs tired eyes, and for a moment the silence feels unbearable. And then the memory of the wow signal surfaces, proof that something once broke the silence. The despair lifts, the work continues, and so the paradox becomes less of a wall and more of a mirror. The wow signal forces us to confront not just whether others exist, but what kind of species we are becoming as we wait. Will we have the patience to keep listening? The discipline to avoid false hope? The humility to accept silence as part of the answer? Or will we grow restless, cynical, distracted, too busy with ourselves to notice when the universe speaks again? The wow signal remains the brightest unanswered knock. And perhaps the most haunting question is not whether it was real, but whether we are ready for the silence that follows if it happens again. By the dawn of the 21st century, the wow signal was no longer just a mysterious event in the archives of Ohio State University. It had become a symbol, a touchstone, a haunting presence that defined an entire field. For SETI, it was both a badge of wonder and a scar of frustration. For skeptics, it was a punchline. For the public, it was a myth, part of the modern folklore of the stars. And for a new generation of researchers, it was a riddle that shaped their identity. SETI had always walked a delicate line. Too much wonder, and it was accused of being pseudoscience, a playground for dreamers and fantasists. Too much caution, and it risked losing the spark that drew young minds into its orbit. The wow signal balanced on that line like a tightrope walker. It was a reminder that the universe might be stranger than we think, and at the same time, that evidence can slip away faster than our instruments can catch it. In the early 2000s, as technology leapt forward, SETI reimagined itself. The Allen, Telescope Array in California's Hat Creek Valley was envisioned as a revolutionary listening post, hundreds of dishes working together like a single ear. Its launch was wrapped in optimism. With so many antennas and so much computing power, surely the next wow signal would not escape. And yet, year after year, the dishes swept the skies and heard only silence. The silence began to bite. In meetings with funding agencies, officials raised eyebrows. Decades of listening and no new wow signal. Politicians asked bluntly, "What if you're listening for something that isn't there?" Astronomers replied with patience, "The search is young, the galaxy is vast, the odds are long." But underneath the calm words was the memory of August 1977. They could not say it aloud, but they thought it. We know it can happen, because once it did. Culturally, the wow signal flourished in places science could not control. On television, it appeared in documentaries with ominous music and dramatic recreations. In novels, it became a prelude to first contact. In films, it was reframed as the opening scene to catastrophe or salvation. Artists painted it, poets praised it, and conspiracy theorists twisted it. The signal that may have been nothing more. The noise had become a canvas onto which humanity projected its deepest hopes and fears. For the researchers themselves, this was complicated. Some bristled at the exaggeration, the pseudo-scientific claims, the wild theories that had no basis in fact. Others welcomed the attention, reasoning that inspiration mattered even if accuracy faltered. In quiet conversations, many admitted the truth without the wow signal SETI might never have survived the lean years. It kept people interested, it kept imaginations alive, it kept the search going, and so, the wow signal became the reluctant mascot of SETI. It appeared on posters, on mugs, on t-shirts at conferences. The digits 6EQUJ5 were emblazoned, like a code, an inside joke among astronomers, and a symbol for enthusiasts. Students wore it proudly, the way medieval alchemists once wore mysterious sigils, a mark of belonging to a tradition of seekers. But mascots can be burdens too. The wow signal was a reminder of what had not happened since. Each year that passed without another anomaly made the silence feel heavier. Each technological leap that failed to uncover a new signal made the mystery sharper. Was the wow signal truly extraordinary, or had we built a mythology around a fluke? The question hung over SETI like a shadow. Inside the community, debates sharpened. Some argued for patience, pointing out that even a century of listening is a blink in cosmic time. Others urged innovation, expand beyond radio, search for technosignatures in light, heat, atmospheric chemistry. A younger generation pushed for AI-driven algorithms, for cross-disciplinary methods, for thinking outside the narrow band of frequencies once considered the most likely channel for communication. The wow signal was a foundation, but it was not enough. And yet, no matter how much methods evolved, the image of Jerry Ehman's red pen circling the digits never faded. It was reprinted in textbooks, projected on lecture hall walls, shared endlessly online. It remained the one tangible artifact of the mystery, proof that something unusual had happened. And in its persistence, it bound the field together. Consider the psychology of the searcher. To spend a lifetime listening to silence requires more than scientific training. It requires faith, not blind faith in aliens, but faith in the value of patience, in the worth of unanswered questions. The wow signal provided a kind of anchor for that faith. It said, yes, the universe can surprise you. Yes, listening matters. Yes, this work is not empty. For skeptics, of course, it remained easy to dismiss. They pointed out the lack of repetition, the possibility of interference, the endless silence since. They mocked the conferences that still discussed it, the students who still wore it like a badge. But even skepticism could not erase it. The wow signal endured not because it proved anything, but because it refused to go away. And so, SETI, in the 21st century found itself defined by a signal that might not have been real. That paradox is its own lesson. In science, most mysteries vanish with better tools, sharper methods, clearer data. But some resist, some linger. And those are the mysteries that change us, whether or not they are ever solved. The wow signal remains such a mystery, a single spike on a graph, a red circle on paper, a story that outgrew its data, a silence that still teaches us how to listen. But if it shaped an entire field with one fleeting burst, what will happen if the universe ever gives us two? By the second decade of the 21st century, the wow signal had entered a new kind of life. It was no longer only an event from 1977, whispered in academic corridors or recounted at conferences. It had become a cultural artifact carried into the digital age, reshaped by new technologies, and sustained by a generation of scientists who had never even seen the big ear, but still felt the echo of its discovery. The world of astronomy had changed. Computers were no longer clattering mainframes spitting out paper printouts. They were networks, clusters, clouds, capable of passing oceans of data at speeds once unimaginable. Algorithms trained on synthetic signals could sift through billions of frequency channels in hours. Machine learning was drafted into service, hunting for anomalies, detecting narrowband spikes, discarding interference from cell phones, satellites, airplanes. Where once astronomers stared at graphs until their eyes blurred, now artificial intelligence carried the first weight of the listening. And yet, despite all the power of silicon, the wow signal remained unmatched. Nothing in the deluge of data carried the same haunting clarity. The algorithms found candidates, flagged bursts, and even raised hopes, but each one dissolved under scrutiny. A satellite out of position, a miscalibrated receiver, a reflection from Earth itself. The silence endured, sharpened by technology rather than softened. But the digital age brought something else: connection. In 1999, SETI Home launched, transforming idle computers into a global ear. Millions of people downloaded the screensaver, watching their laptops chew through blocks of sky, the jagged lines of radio data dancing across the screen like modern hieroglyphs. Students in dorm rooms, workers in offices, retirees in living rooms. Together, they built one of the largest distributed supercomputers in history. And though no new wow signal emerged from those countless hours of computation, the project did something equally profound. It turned listening into a shared human act. The wow signal became the emblem of that act. Participants wore it like a badge, proof that they belonged to a global community of listeners. Forums filled with volunteers trading stories about their machines, speculating about signals, dreaming of the day when one of them might stumble across the sequel to 6EQUJ5. In a world fractured by borders and politics, the idea that millions of strangers could unite in listening to the stars carried its own quiet beauty. At the same time, telescopes themselves grew more ambitious. The square-kilometre array, planned across South Africa and Australia, promised to dwarf everything that had come before. Its sprawling arms would cover deserts with antennas, capable of surveying the sky with unprecedented sensitivity. When scientists described its potential, they often invoked the wow signal as motivation. If one dish in Ohio could catch a whisper, what might an entire continent of dishes hear? Artificial intelligence deepened the search. Neural networks, trained on simulated alien signals, could detect patterns no human eye would recognize. They learned to discard interference with ruthless efficiency, freeing astronomers from false alarms. Some even speculated that if the wow signal happened today, it might not even be noticed by a human first. A machine might flag it, log it, analyze it, and in the process, strip away the awe of Jerry Ehman's red pen circling those digits. And yet, awe is part of the reason we listen at all. The wow signal thus lived in tension between machine precision and human imagination. The data itself was sterile: numbers, frequencies, intensities. But what kept it alive was not the numbers, but the stories. Stories told in classrooms, in forums, in documentaries, in conversations between strangers who discovered they both knew of that strange night in 1977. Even governments took notice. NASA, ESA, and private organizations occasionally invoked the wow signal when justifying new missions. It was a hook, a way to explain to the public why listening mattered. A single signal, never repeated, had seeded an entire infrastructure of listening and still silence. Silence deepened by power, by precision, by decades of waiting. Silence transformed from absence into atmosphere, a presence all its own. The paradox sharpened. Had the wow signal been real, or had humanity built an empire of hope around an illusion? Could a single misidentified event really sustain an entire movement for decades? And yet, the fact remained. Billions had been invested, generations had been inspired, artists had been moved, simply because of one unexplained whisper. In that sense, the wow signal had already succeeded. It had given humanity a story to share, a reason to gather, a purpose to listen. Even if no second signal ever came, the first had already changed us. Imagine standing in a control room today, surrounded by glowing monitors, the quiet whir of servers filling the air. On one screen, a neural network churns through petabytes of data. On another, a telescope half a world away pivots towards Sagittarius. A student, too young to remember dial-up internet, leans forward with the same anticipation Jerry Ehman felt in 1977. The universe is silent, but the silence hums with possibility. The wow signal no longer belongs to one man, one telescope, or one night in August. It belongs to all of us. It is a story of patience, of wonder, of faith in listening. And perhaps the question it leaves us with is not whether it was real, but whether we will still be listening if the universe chooses to speak again. The wow signal was never only a question about aliens. It became a question about us, about what kind of species gathers around a faint whisper and decides to build cathedrals of listening. Time has pushed the original printout into the color of old parchment, the red circle soft as dried cherry on the page. But the feeling inside that circle remains fresh. A human heartbeat caught answering something that might have traveled for lifetimes before reaching Ohio. In a museum gallery, under glass that holds its own soft reflections, a child presses both hands to the case as if touch could read the past. The paper looks ordinary, columns of alphanumeric code, a margin that could belong to any lab notebook, until the eye falls on the curved stroke of red that made a small gasp into an artifact. A gallery attendant speaks quietly to a group, explaining radio frequencies, hydrogen's spectral line, a telescope that listened from a field where golfers now walk. The child does not register the technicals. The child registers wonder. We heard a sound from far away. We kept it. Across town, in a dim cafe, a young poet stands on a small wooden stage. The microphone tastes like iron in the mouth. The audience is a river of silhouettes and teacups. The poem has the shape of a wave. 72 seconds of sky, like a key in an unseen lock. When the poem ends, there is a hush. Someone breathes out. Someone else writes 6EQUJ5 in the condensation on a mug, a private spell that evaporates before anyone notices. Outside, the city keeps its own pulse. A bus hisses, a bicycle bell chirps, a satellite crosses above these roofs, and no one looks up. Still, the idea has moved. The signal is no longer buried in a printout. It is inside human mouths. In a quiet control room at 3 a.m, an astronomer sits in the half-light of instruments and monitors. The air carries the faint synthetic scent of electronics. A mug leaves a ring on a pad where past rings have made a ghostly calendar. Tonight's target is a nearby star with a small, rocky planet. Quiet data, spectra that look like rain sliding down windows. The astronomer thinks of the printout without wanting to. It arrives the way a remembered face does in an idle moment, not intrusive, just present. 72 seconds is nothing. A song holds more time than that. A kettle takes longer to boil. And still, a career can be built on honoring those 72 seconds. The signal has traveled out of astronomy into ritual. Community groups hold silent minutes on clear nights. Gatherings on school fields where telescopes bloom like metal flowers. Someone tells the story for those who have not heard it, the way a favorite tale is told at family tables. Someone else passes around a copy of the printout in a plastic sleeve so the corners will not fray. Teenagers share snacks and point phones at the Milky Way, framing it as if the sky were a celebrity. An older man remarks that the stars used to feel farther away. A girl with a red scarf asks whether the signal could have been a goodbye. No, one answers her directly. They let the sky answer with its indifference. In a church built of brick, morning light falls through stained glass onto pews polished by generations of palms. The pastor speaks of listening, of patience, of how faith can be a discipline rather than a certainty. There are prayers that are words, she says softly, and there are prayers that are simply attention. She tells her congregation the story of a team that listened to the darkness and received a single clear tone for just over a minute. She does not claim it as divine. She claims it as example. Attention is a form of love in a noisy world. A few streets away, in a zendo that smells of tatami and pine, a monk sits with a circle of students. The bell sounds once. Breath slows. Thought swims and settles. Afterward, the monk smiles and says, "Silence is never empty. It is crowded with what you did not notice." The students breathe out small laughs. Someone raises a hand and asks, "And about the signal in Ohio?" The monk nods. "A bell rang somewhere," he says, "and we are still listening to the echo." Listening changes the listener. Artists have made the signal visible. In a warehouse with tall windows, an installation throws a thin white line across a black wall, a single spike rising once, then a long plane of nothing. People walk through the room and pull their own reflections across the line. A soundtrack made of radio hum and breath purls around the ankles. In another space, a sculptor turns radio waves into steel, a helix spiral with one flare brighter than the rest. Fingers of school children slip into the negative spaces as if learning a new alphabet. And indeed they are. An alphabet of patience, the grammar of maybe. The internet has made the signal restless. In a video that loops through millions of feeds, a hand draws a red circle around 6EQUJ5 and then cuts to the night sky, then to a woman whose eyes fill as she says, "We are not alone," then to a man who laughs and calls it a glitch. Arguments accumulate like sediment under the post. A teenager in Manila writes a paragraph that holds both skepticism and longing with a maturity that startles older readers. A grandmother in Lagos tells a story about her own grandmother who pointed at the moon and said people would one day go there, and no one believed her. Someone in Warsaw posts a chart about interference sources and how to filter them. The world is in the thread, not tidy, not in agreement, but assembled. Skeptics do a necessary job. In a seminar room with a whiteboard smudged into a kind of cloud, a physicist lists false alarms from the last 5 years. Aircraft transponders, satellites, harmonics from ground equipment, even a staff microwave oven. Students laugh at the last one, then stop when the professor explains how easy it is to fool yourself in a noisy spectrum. She presses the chalk into the board and draws the hydrogen line. "If you wanted to speak to a stranger who knows nothing of your language," she says, "you would begin with the simplest word you both share." The classroom holds that thought with the careful quiet of people cradling something breakable. Hope does not argue with caution. It sits beside it. A retired electrician in Oaxaca has a folder of printouts, a notebook of scrupulous dates and times from the Citizen Computing project on his old desktop. He knows it is unlikely his machine will be the one to find anything, but he runs the program whenever he is not using the computer. The ritual is a comfort. On Thursdays, He teaches kids how to solder at the library makerspace, and, without fail, someone asks about aliens. He says, "I do not know," with a smile that makes not knowing feel like permission to keep asking. Fear keeps its own file on the story. Futurists speak of a great filter, some threshold that most civilizations fail to cross. The signal could be from a world that did not make it, a flare without a follow-up. The idea stains even hopeful conversations. A novelist writes a scene in which the last astronomer on a dying planet throws a switch and sends a continuous tone toward a little-known region of Sagittarius, not to save anyone, only to be heard. That scene is read aloud in a bookshop with plants in the windows and a patient cat that sleeps through everything. When the reading ends, the room is drained and quiet. Someone coughs. Someone claps late, as if sound can be a bridge across discomfort. Science keeps walking, as science does. The search expands beyond radio, laser pulses, atmospheric chemistry on exoplanets, heat signatures that look like industry from a long way off. The signal that inspired these angles stands in the background, like an old teacher who retired, but still comes to the school plays. No one bows to it, and everyone acknowledges it without words. The discipline has learned not to promise fireworks. It promises process instead. New arrays in dry places where the air is clean of water. Code that knows how to ignore 1,000 earthly noises without throwing away the one that matters. A traveling exhibition pairs artifacts from the early days, of radio with renderings of exoplanets. Bakelite knobs, hand-lettered labels, a photomultiplier tube that looks like a small cathedral of glass. In one corner, a theatre projects a slow film. Wheat bending in wind under a big Midwestern sky. A metal frame that used to be a telescope. A printer's teeth ticking paper forward. A hand that is not high drama, only a hand that circles a line, because sometimes hands know before mouths do. People sit longer than the benches invite. They leave with a feeling that might be described as gentleness toward the unknown. The signal has entered ceremony in small ways that make people feel part of something larger. A couple in Delhi folds 72 paper cranes and places them in a jar to mark the beginning of their shared life, listening for whatever comes. A robotics club in Nairobi names their competition round hydrogen line and paints a thin stripe on the floor so the robots have to cross it perfectly to score. A high school in Reykjavik holds a midnight reading of science essays every equinox. Someone always chooses the wow signal, and someone always chooses a counterpoint by a careful skeptic. And they read them back to back so that the night holds both patience and restraint. A theologian writes that wonder can be secular and sacred at once, and the signal proves it. Not because it points to a particular meaning, but because it reminds a technological species that listening is not the same as asking for applause. A psychologist notes that common mystery can bind communities that disagree about almost everything else. It is a rare story that allows both humility and pride. Pride in the machines we built, humility before the scales those machines revealed. There are smaller, stranger ways the signal has shaped life. A tattooist in Lisbon inks a fine single spike into the inner wrists of clients who want a reminder to keep paying attention. A watchmaker in Kyoto designs a face where a slender hand flicks once every 72 seconds, not to tell time in any useful way, but to tell a story no one asked a watch to tell. A ceramicist in Rabat glazes bowls with a band of tiny numbers around the rim, a domestic halo of code in kitchens that do not otherwise discuss astronomy. These are ornaments that tip the day toward wonder a noticeable degree. And always the fact returns. After that single narrow-band rise, silence. The silence embarrasses no one who works with it every day. It becomes the medium rather than the message. A biologist reminds her students that for centuries, no one could culture the organisms that rule our own guts. Then a method arrived, and a whole continent of life appeared where there had been blankness. The analogy travels into the listening rooms. If a method can change what exists for us in a petri dish, a method can change what exists for us in the sky. In a port city, two dock workers share a thermos in pre-dawn cold, staring at the water while a radio plays softly on a crate. A program about the night sky mentions the old signal. One worker says, if someone called once and never again, maybe they dialed the wrong number. The other laughs, then says, or maybe we did. They do not solve anything. The ship's horn throws a long note across the harbour. For a moment, everyone is part of a world where signals are ordinary, and we are the ones who are late. Night carries the story better than day. A valley breathes. Dishes tilt. An operator marks a timestamp that lines up with other timestamps around the world. A fox passes through the circle of a security light as softly as a shadow remembering its body. Servers murmur a long vowel. Somewhere, a student writes a line of code that will make a small difference months from now. Somewhere else, a child dreams that the sky is a page and the stars are punctuation marks in a sentence that has not finished. The wow signal has become part of our grammar. It gives us a way to ask questions without pretending we know the answers. It asks us to hold two truths in one hand, that we may be hearing echoes and that we may be hearing greetings. It asks us to become the kind of listeners who do not confuse longing with evidence or caution with cynicism. It has not told us who sent it or why. It has told us who we are when we decide to pay attention anyway. And if a second voice arrives, through radio or light, through heat or vapor, through a brightness on a planet's night side that should not be there, will we recognize it without breaking the silence that allowed it to reach us? Or has the first whisper already changed us so much that the next will sound unmistakably like ourselves? The wow signal is more than 40 years old now, older than many of the astronomers who continue to invoke it in lectures and proposals. Time has not dulled it. Instead, time has polished it, turning a brief anomaly into a story with a sheen of legend. What makes it endure is not only what it might mean about the cosmos, but what it has come to mean about us. It has become a generational bridge, a riddle handed down, a shared ember of wonder. In a university library, a graduate student sits surrounded by papers, graphs, and datasets from new surveys of exoplanets. On her laptop glows the familiar, a red circle, copied from Jerry Ehman's original printout. She stares at it, chewing the inside of her cheek. To her, the circle is not quaint history, it is a reminder of unfinished business. Her professors remind her of caution, of skepticism, of how many false alarms exist in astronomy. But she looks at the digits as a kind of dare. If they could find one spike in 1977 with primitive instruments, what right do we have to give up now? In another part of the world, at a planetarium in Seoul, an educator tells a group of children about the signal. He dims the lights, projects the Milky Way on the domed ceiling, and describes how a telescope once caught a whisper from Sagittarius. The children gasp, laugh, whisper among themselves. A small boy raises his hand and asks, "Did they ever answer back?" The educator pauses, lets the silence itself answer. Then he says softly, "Maybe they are still speaking, and maybe we have not yet learned how to hear." The dome fills with stars and the sound of children breathing, the sound of imagination sparking. In homes across continents, late-night readers discover the wow signal through documentaries or podcasts. Some find themselves staring out of their windows, their neighborhoods sleeping under sodium lamps and starlight, thinking about voices crossing unimaginable distances. The knowledge unsettles some, comforts others, but it leaves none untouched. The wow signal, they realize, is not only about whether aliens exist. It is about the hunger to be part of something larger, the yearning for connection across emptiness. For scientists, the endurance of the wow signal is double-edged. On one hand, it keeps interest alive, ensures funding, inspires new recruits. On the other, it sets a shadow standard, the one anomaly to which every candidate signal is compared. Data from modern arrays is filtered, scanned, and then inevitably measured against the wow signal. Does it rise and fall like that one did? Does it hold the same narrowband purity? Would Jerry have circled this? The questions hum in labs as though the 1977 signal were an elder scientist whose opinion still counts. Meanwhile, skeptics grow sharper. They argue that myth has outgrown fact, that the wow signal has been romanticized into something it was not. They point to silence, to 40 years of emptiness, to better instruments that have found nothing. They write essays reminding the public that science is not in the business of legends. And yet, for all their words, the story does not vanish. It resists dismissal because people do not love it for its certainty. They love it for its mystery. The wow signal has also seeded personal rituals. A painter in Buenos Aires begins each canvas with a red circle somewhere on the underlayer, hidden beneath the paint but always present. A runner in Nairobi marks every 72 seconds of her practice with a deeper breath, syncing her body to the rhythm of the anomaly. A programmer in Montreal uses the digits 6EQUJ5 as a password root, a secret nod to the story that first drew him into science. In these small private ways, the signal has threaded itself into lives far from astronomy. Culturally, it has grown roots in art and literature. New novels weave it into plots of cosmic contact, allegories of human longing. Films present it as a haunting prelude to discovery or disaster. Songs use it as refrain, 72-second motifs looping like a heartbeat inside electronic landscapes. Each retelling adds another layer, shaping how humanity imagines itself in relation to the stars. The wow signal has become part of our myth-making machinery. Philosophically, it continues to haunt debates. The great silence, why no one else speaks, has become sharper because of it. If the wow signal was real, then silence since is heavier, stranger. Was it a solitary flare from a dying world? Was it a deliberate one-time beacon, proof without invitation? Or was it simply noise, elevated into legend by human hunger? The paradox sharpens with every year that passes without repetition, and yet, the silence has not eroded patience. If anything, it has deepened it. New generations of scientists take their place at consoles, their backs bent to keyboards, their ears pressed not to seashells but to servers. They are listening not only for aliens, but for continuity, for the assurance that the work of those who circled digits in the 1970s is not forgotten. The wow signal is their inheritance, and they guard it with quiet pride. The endurance of the signal proves something profound about us, that we are a species that will build meaning around even the faintest whisper, that we will carry a question across decades, across cultures, across languages, that we will let a fragment shape our art, our science, our dreams. It is not evidence that aliens exist. It is evidence that humans hope. Imagine, years from now, a signal does arrive again, clear, deliberate, undeniable. When that day comes, the wow signal will not be erased. It will be remembered as the ember that kept us listening, the myth that prepared us to receive. And if no second signal ever comes, the wow signal will remain as a monument to patience, to imagination, to what it means to be human. It leaves us still with a question not answered but deepened. If the universe gave us one whisper and nothing more, what does that say about the listener? The wow signal began as ink on thin paper, a quiet column of characters no more dramatic than a grocery list, until a human hand drew a red curve around a single stretch and turned data into wonder. A minute and 12 seconds of something that rose and fell with the Earth's rotation, narrow and clean, a tone so precise it felt like intention. Long after the printer cooled, long after the telescope was dismantled, the line kept ringing in minds and rooms and stories. It became the hinge of 1,000 small rituals, the way an astronomer pauses before pressing record, the way a teacher lowers the lights in a planetarium, the way a musician holds a note just a fraction longer than comfort. On a windless, Night. A modern dish turns with the grace of a dancer, all steel and mathematics, and comes to rest on a patch of sky near Sagittarius. Inside the control room, only the fans speak, a soft, continuous hush like surf heard through a wall. A graduate student rubs a smudge from her glasses and checks the drift rate, the bandpass, the RFI mask that keeps earthly chatter from imitating the sky. The spectrum paints itself across the monitor as a grey rain, steady and unremarkable. She sips lukewarm coffee, rechecks coordinates for a second time because repetition is not superstition here. It is respect. Respect for a moment in 1977 when the rain turned into a single bright spike and then dissolved again. She knows the story. Everyone does. She also knows the cautionary paragraphs. Her task is not to dream, but to notice. The two are closer than people think. Thousands of miles away, a musician sits at a keyboard in a small studio whose walls are pinned with photographs of radio dishes and pale star maps. He has recorded the buzz of failing streetlights, the hum inside refrigerators, the whisper of elevator cables, trying to teach himself the texture of man-made interference. Then he programs a narrow tone to rise and fall with the rotation of a world he has never seen. A simulation of how a beacon would breathe if it lived on a planet and not on a satellite. When the curve settles into silence, he leaves it there. A song that ends too soon becomes a place for listeners to finish the story themselves. He saves the file as Hydrogen Lullaby, closes his eyes, and imagines a civilization that never met him teaching him how to hold a note. In a museum gallery where climate and light are managed by machines in another room, a copy of the famous printout lies under glass. A child presses her fingertips to the case without touching it, reading aloud the odd alphanumerics, laughing at the way the sequence looks like a secret password. Her mother crouches beside her and whispers about radio and hydrogen and how people can pull meaning from noise if they learn to listen carefully enough. The child asks whether the signal was friendly. The mother answers that no one knows, and that not knowing can be beautiful. They stand a little longer. They do not take a photograph. Some moments prefer to live in breath. In a quiet chapel at the edge of a campus, a chaplain speaks to a small group of students who came because the night felt heavy and the world felt loud. She tells them that silence is not absence, that silence is a room with the lights off where shapes still exist, waiting for eyes to adjust. She tells them about the radio telescope that heard a single clean note and the decades of patience that followed. She does not call the note divine. She calls the patience a form of love, attention offered without a promise of reward. A student who is not sure what he believes feels something loosen in his chest at that word. Patience as love. He writes it in the margin of his notebook and closes the cover gently, as if that could protect the sentence from the weather. Critics still sharpen their instruments. In an office stacked with journals, a scientist lists the ways a signal can pretend to be special. Aircraft, satellites, harmonics, reflections, clocks. She is not a villain in this story. She is a good teacher. She says that extraordinary claims require proof that can survive boredom, repetition, and the indignities of calibration. She shows how the frequency of hydrogen became a shared alphabet only because people agreed to start there. She reminds her students that the beauty of a result is not evidence. Beauty is why we return to the lab when a result survives. They nod, some a little reluctantly, because it is hard to love both poetry and rigor in the same hour, but the field demands exactly that. The field has grown. Radio is no longer the only ear. Optical instruments listen for laser pulses, sharp as the strike of flint. Infrared surveys look for heat that should not be there, a quiet signature of industry on a world too far for our eyes to see. Spectrographs read exoplanet skies for chemical syllables that life tends to pronounce. Even the negative results speak, teaching where to look next, where to widen the search, where to be patient a little longer. The wow. Signal has become less a target than a compass. Point toward the possibility that one clean tone can change the appetite of a species. The story has grown too into the margins of daily life. A watchmaker in Kyoto designs a face where a thin second hand flares once every 72 seconds, a private wink to those who know the reference. A ceramic studio in Rabat glazes bowls with a faint line of digits just under the lip, a domestic halo of numbers that will pass through dishwater and dinners and remain. A high school robotics team in Nairobi paints a hydrogen line on the gym floor and requires their bots to cross it with grace. Points are lost for brute force that ignores alignment. Small gestures, but the world is a quilt of small gestures. The internet did what it always does. It turned the story into arguments and jokes, and then sometimes into tenderness. Clips circulate of a red pen circling a sequence. Somebody adds a string quartet under the footage, and people share it more widely than anyone expected. A thread blooms where strangers from 6 countries trade memories of seeing the Milky Way for the first time. A skeptic posts a clear, patient explanation of how narrowband signals can be faked, and a dreamer thanks him for the lesson rather than calling him a killjoy. In the comments below, the same teenager who once wrote a careful paragraph about possibility returns to say that she now studies electrical engineering and that it all started with a screenshot of a yellowed page. Stories change careers. Careers change instruments. Instruments change what can be heard. In a lecture hall where the air smells faintly of old chalk and warm projectors, a professor writes the Drake equation slowly, pausing at each term. Star, formation, planets, habitable worlds, life, intelligence, technology, lifetime. The last letter lingers on the board like a held breath. L, the span of a conversation across centuries. He adds nothing more, not a number, not even a guess, and the restraint is its own kind of eloquence. After class, a student approaches and says his grandmother remembers the original newspaper headline and kept it folded inside a cookbook so she would see it whenever she baked. The professor smiles at the way wonder hides in practical places. He once found a star map folded into a tire repair manual at a second-hand store. People tuck the night into odd pockets. Consider the final nights for Arecibo before its dish became a ruin. The jungle hum beyond the railings. A heron lifts from the trees with a sound like silk pulled from a drawer. Engineers in hard hats walk slowly, looking at bolts as if looking at old photographs. They speak quietly, not because noise would break, anything but because reverence sits on the tongue like a weight. The facility will not listen again, but the years it listened have become part of the discipline's muscle memory. The loss hurts without becoming a wound that stops the work. New ears will rise. Old ears became the soil for that. The wow. Signal passes through all of this like the oldest story told in new languages. And always there is the question with teeth. If someone spoke once, why no second hello? Theories multiply in rooms that smell like coffee and dry markers. Perhaps broadcasts are brief because power is expensive. Perhaps civilizations learn early that loudness invites predators. Perhaps worlds turn inward after a golden century of curiosity, building gardens inside simulations rich enough to distract them from the stars. Perhaps the signal we heard was an accident, a leak, a rehearsal, or a goodbye. The truth may be ordinary. The truth may be devastating. Most truths share, a trait that makes philosophers sigh. They require us to live with them rather than applaud them. And still, the world keeps inventing applause for silence. A choir in Lisbon commissions a work that blooms for 72 seconds and then remains unscored for a full minute more. The audience sits with their hands in their laps, learning how to appreciate what is not happening. A school in Reykjavik hosts a midnight reading of essays about listening every equinox. The gym smells like varnish and cold air, and someone always brings cinnamon buns because rituals prefer sweetness. A makerspace in Oaxaca begins each week with a brief noise check in which every machine is turned off and everyone listens for the hum that remains. It is often the wind sneaking under the door, but sometimes it is the voice of a person who did not know they were holding their breath. In private, in unremarkable kitchens, gratitude collects around the story like steam on a window. A couple washes dishes after dinner with a podcast about astronomy playing on a phone balanced against a jar of rice. The host mentions the wow. signal, and one person smiles without looking up, as if the name belonged to a friend who moved away, but still writes postcards. A kid at the table draws a rocket on a napkin and asks whether aliens need sleep. Someone says probably. Someone else says definitely. The napkin goes on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a fox. It will survive there until the paper turns the color of tea. Stories hitch rides this way and travel farther than press releases. The field remains honest. No confirmed repeats, no message that destroys doubt, no clean conversation across the void. The honesty does not shrink the story, it gives the story bones. Hope grows best when it can lean on something that does not give. The wow signal has become that structure, an event framed by caution, an inspiration framed by method, a myth framed by a community that knows how to say, "We do not know," without turning the phrase into sorrow. You who have listened to this long bedtime journey, you who kept company with the slow patience of scientists and the quick inventions of artists, you who let a single minute of radio become an hour of reflection, you are part of why the story lives. Without listeners, signals disappear. Without patience, wonder evaporates before it can turn into work. You have kept both. That matters. If a second voice arrives, a thread of radio that rises clean from the spectrum, a blink of laser light that refuses to be a glitch, a heat pattern on a far world's night side that looks unnervingly like cities, there will be rooms ready for it. There will be checklists and cross-checks and cautious sentences. There will also be a pause in which an entire species takes a breath together. The breath will not be audible, it will still shake the leaves. And if no second voice comes in our lifetime, the first whisper will continue to do its work, turning strangers into listeners, turning listeners into caretakers of night. The line circled in red on that old page did not promise company. It promised practice, practice at noticing, practice at being humble about what we do not know, practice at building tools worthy of surprise. When the story comes to mind years from now, when a teacher dims the lights, when a child looks through a small telescope for the first time, when a tired researcher presses save on data that look like rain, remember that the best part of the story was never proof. The best part was what it asked us to become while we waited. Thank you for staying awake with this mystery, for lending your hours to a silence that hums with possibility, for choosing wonder in a century that asks you to hurry. If this kind of listening helps you drift into a kinder sleep, or if it keeps you awake with a gentle, useful curiosity, you are exactly the audience this story hoped to find. If you would like more night journeys like this, quietly joining the channel, liking, or subscribing is the small lighthouse that helps this little ship leave the harbor again. No pressure, just gratitude for every traveler who keeps watch with us. The stars do not owe us an answer. We will keep listening anyway. That may be the most human signal we can send back.